Good morning, students. This is class 10 science. Listen, how do organisms reproduce? How do organisms reproduce? In continuation with the last class, today we'll study about pollination, different kinds of pollination, and fertilization. In the last class, students, we have studied about the structure of flower, and we have also studied that the flower which contain only one sex organ, either stamen or carpel, are called unisexual flower. For example, papaya and watermelon. And the flower which has both sex organs are called bisexual flowers. For example, rose, mustard. Now, we will study about pollination. What is pollination? Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the flower. Transfer of pollen grains, the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of a flower is termed as pollination. Pollination is of two types, self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination and cross-pollination. In self-pollination, the pollen grains of a flower are transferred to the stigma of either the same or genetically similar flower. What happens in self-pollination? In self-pollination, the pollen grains of a flower are transferred to the stigma of the same flower or genetically similar flower on the same plant. In cross-pollination, the pollen grains from the anther of one flower are transferred to the stigma of the another flower. And the transfer of pollen grains is carried out by an external agency like wind, water, insects, birds, etc. So the basic difference between self-pollination and cross-pollination is transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of the same flower or on the same plant, and cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of a different plant. Now, what happens after pollination? When pollen grains from anther of a flower transfer to the stigma of the same flower or another flower on the same plant is called self-pollination. And when pollen grains from anther of a flower on one plant are transferred to the stigma on another similar plant, it is termed as cross-pollination. Now, what happens after pollination? See, from this picture, we'll study. When the pollen grains land on the stigma, which is sticky, see, you can see over here, when the pollen grains falls on the stigma, it absorbs water and nourishment over here. Then the pollen grains form a tube called as pollen tube. See, this pollen, only one pollen grains form a tube which travels through the stigma. This is the path and enters from here. Inside this pollen grain, male germ cells travel. See, this is the pollen grain. Once it lands over here, it absorbs water and nourishment from here and forms a pollen tube which enters through the style, it enters the ovary. Pollen tube passes through the style, reaches ovary and enters the ovule through its micropyle. This opening is known as micropyle. See over here. Is it clear? Pollen grain lands on the stigma, forms a pollen tube. This pollen tube travels through stigma and enters the ovary through the micropyle. The tube carries two male gametes. This pollen tube carries two male gametes which reach over here. Pollen tube enters the embryo sac and bursts open to release the two male gametes. It enters here, bursts open and releases two male gametes. One male gamete fuses with the egg to form zygote. One male gamete fuses with the female germ cell to form zygote. The zygote later forms the embryo. The second male gamete fuses with the central cell to form triploid primary cell. See, the second male fuses with the polar nucleus. We can say it fuses with the polar nucleus to form a triploid cell. This is called triple fusion because it involves fusion of three nuclei, two polar nuclei and one male germ cell. As it involves fusion of three cells, three nucleus, it is known as triple fusion. Now, this type of fertilization is called double fertilization because fertilization is occurring twice. Once a single male germ cell fuses with the egg, and the second, the two polar nuclei fuses with the second germ cell. So this is how fertilization takes place. And what is fertilization? Fertilization is the fusion of male gamete with female gamete. See, in this diagram also it is clear. This is the nucleus, two polar nuclei. This is the egg cell. This is the ovary. The male gametes will enter over here. One male gamete will fuse with the egg cell and the other with these two polar nuclei. Fertilization occurs when male gamete present in the pollen grain joins a female gamete or egg present in the ovule. When pollen grains fall on the stigma of carpel, it bursts open and grows a pollen tube downward through the style towards female gamete in ovary. A male gamete moves down the pollen tube. The pollen tube enters the ovule in the ovary. Tip of the pollen tube bursts open and male gamete comes out of pollen tube. In ovary, male gamete of pollen combines with nucleus of female gamete or egg present in the ovule to form a fertilized egg or zygote. The zygote divides several times to form an embryo within the ovule. Ovule develops into a tough coat around it and gradually converts it into a seed. So this zygote ultimately converts into a seed. Ovary grows rapidly and ripens to form fruit. The wall of the ovary, it grows rapidly and it ripens to form a fruit with seeds inside it. The outer parts of the flower, like the sepals, petals, stamens, stigma, style, dry up and fall off or wither off. The place on plant where we had flowers, we now have a fruit. A fruit protect the seed. And we can say the seed contain a baby plant. The seed contain a baby plant. The part of baby in seed which develops into shoot is called the plumule, and the part which develops into root is called the radicle. Is called the radicle. The part of the seed which contains stored food for the baby plant is called the cotyledon. The baby plant present inside the seed is in an inactive form. The baby plant is in inactive form, but when it gets suitable conditions to germinate, it forms new plant out of the seed. So you all must sow some seeds. You must also mango or some tree seeds, mangoes or any seed. So in your lifetime, you can say that you have also grown a tree. So this was all about fertilization and pollination and in seed formation and fruit formation in plants, and advantage of seed formation. What are the advantage of seed formation is seeds are a major item of human food, and seeds being small and light can easily be dispersed to long and distant places, and because of the tough seed coats, we can say, and dormant embryo, we can say seed can pass through unfavorable seasons without any harm, and Seeds are a complete package for survival and growth of plant due to dormancy of embryo and presence of reserve food and protective seed codes. Uh, a seed can protect the baby plant for a long time also, and they can be stored for months or even years. They will germinate only when they are provided with suitable conditions. And when a seed germinates, and you know what are the conditions of germination, a new plant grows. So this was all about flower. In the next class, we'll study about reproduction in human beings. Reproduction in human beings. So have a nice day. Thank you.